Okay, so principles, I call this lecture Principles of Case Control and Cohort Studies. Let's have a look at different study designs now, please. Okay, so the scientific basis of most of our medical knowledge is the experiment. This is the best thing. Generally, if we really do an experiment, if we really can control all the factors, we can see the impact of the different exposures, for example. Unfortunately, generally, this is unethical to perform. It is unethical to perform experiments on people. Or not unfortunately, I'm very happy that it's not ethical and not acceptable, but it makes, we have to think in a different way. Yeah, thus we have to be content with trials, for example. In the clinical setting, the best design to study exposure and outcome, I would call is an RCT, a randomized controlled clinical trial. Or with other words, to be frank and open to you, is like, this is a study design for doctors. Many of you are doctors, for doctors who can't count, because if you do a good randomized trial, it's a perfect study design. If you do a good clinical trial, both groups are supposed, the exposed and the non-exposed are identical. And if there's any difference, it's probably due to the intervention. So you don't have to count very much. If you've got 1,000 people in the one arm and 1,000 in the other arm, and here you've got 100 people cured, and here you've got only 10 people cured, you see that your new treatment is probably 10 times as good as the placebo, for example. Yes, but this is a very special setting which we cannot often use in public health. The perfect designed randomized clinical trial takes care of all possible biases and confounders. So all disturbing factors probably in the ideal setting are not there, and gives the relevant figures of risk and effects. For example, relative risks, absolute risks. We can use this easily. In the RCT, we can allocate subjects, exposure, dosages, time periods, and so on. We can, you have heard a lot about this probably in the development of the recent vaccines for corona. It is the basis for evidence-based medicine and thus mainly used in clinical epidemiology. Yes, what can we do in public health epidemiology? In observational epidemiology, we cannot allocate exposures. We have to accept the experiments, nature designs, or society designs. We just have a look at them. We have to have a look at them. Yes, and how do we do this? This strange slide, maybe a picture for you, summarizes in my mind how research normally is done. All patients with the condition of interest, for example, are given here in this population. We normally choose a sample of this population. We never test everybody. It's far too big and totally inefficient. So, and impossible. We usually have restrictions of limited resources. So we would take preferably a very good sample, a representative sample of the entire population. This sample we take into account, this is our study population, and we measure them based on selection bias, measurement, and confounders, and chance. And we try to measure and then come to a conclusion. Wow, okay, smoking is not good for you. And what do we know? This conclusion actually focuses primarily on the sample, because these are the only people we really looked at. In reality, we also use this conclusion for other parts of society. And as you can see in the number of question marks here, the closer the other parts of society are, closer to our sample are, the more likely this association can hold. This conclusion can be realistic. The further away we have more question marks. Maybe other factors play a role. So if you hear about a study in the United States of America where they found out something really important, yes, it tells you something about this population under investigation. Certainly quite something about the population surrounding them, maybe in the United States or Canada. And maybe in India, still some of the factors apply, but maybe some don't. So you have to be a bit more cautious and maybe do your own study. Is this clear? So this is what we do. This is normally the way we do research. So I'm suggesting you two different study designs here now. On the one hand side, the two most commonly used or very often used study designs in epidemiology is, one of them is the cohort study. How does it work? In the population, you identify exposed individuals and unexposed individuals, preferably a whole cohort, a whole group of people. Some of them are exposed, some of them are not exposed. You follow them over time and see who develops the disease. So you see what happens to them. I normally like to draw it like draw study designs like a flowchart. And here you can see this is a cohort study, typical cohort study. This is the entire population. Again, we take a sample of them, probably a clearly defined group, a cohort. They all, typical for them is they all have not the disease under investigation. They can have other diseases, but not what we're looking at. Then among them, we identify some of them are exposed to a risk factor which we are interested in, and some are not exposed. This is the lower arm here. We follow them over time, over a certain period of time, and we see how many develop the disease in the exposed group and how many develop the disease in the non-exposed group. This is the whole simple principle. Today you will get to know the British doctor study, very famous, I think a study which everybody should know because it's one of the traditional but also really long-lasting cohort studies. Richard Dole, who was the principal investigator, he started the study with contacting all doctors at that time in Britain. At that time, it was in the 1950s, so long time ago. Most of them were male, but there were also some female doctors. And he asked them at certain points in time, over a longer period of time, over 50 years actually, the study lasted really long, asked them, the doctors contacted them and asked them, do you smoke? And how much do you smoke? And so on. And then followed them and followed over time and always received the death certificates of people who died. And he had to look whether they died, what they died of, and whether more people died in the exposed or in the unexposed group. Typical example for a cohort study. Any question about this study design? Okay. So let's have a look at an example. Some years ago, there was a study done which looked at HIV infections, and the question was, do HIV infections cause a risk factor for developing tuberculosis? Jennifer, you had a point before, maybe. I didn't see your hand before.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the previous slide. In this case, we are imagining that all the deaths or the outcome of the disease is due to one risk factor. If you do a cohort study, I'm looking at it as a limitation to the cohort study.
Yeah, I will show you limitations and advantages in a minute. But you're absolutely right. Not all, not necessarily all outcomes are related and positively associated with the exposure. So it might be even the other way around. But we will have a look at it in a minute. I just wanted to show you the principle first. Okay, here back to our example from New York. 215 HIV positive individuals were involved in the study, and 298 HIV negative individuals were involved. These people were followed over 2 years' time. And after this time, you saw there was a clear difference between the TB cases, the higher number of TB cases in the HIV positive and then in the HIV negative. So it indicates, this very simple study design indicates HIV seems to be a risk factor for developing TB. Okay. Very simple, very easy. Okay, now, but in real life, I would need to be a second person. So I don't have this split personality, but now at the moment I need to actually think in a different way. In real life, the extent of the population exposed is, we don't always know. The detection of a problem after cases have been reported is very often. So we need quick answers. So we normally hear lots of people are ill. So what do? We can't set up a study waiting 2 years, can we always? Or a long time, whatever long it be. So we cannot wait for more persons to get ill. It's not ethical in some situations. So therefore the cohort study is not always applicable. We have to think about. So a second way, is there a second way? Yes, there is. We can look at cases and find out how many of them were exposed to. We already have a lot of people ill, and we can ask them, so have you been smoking or not? And the hypothesis, correlation between exposure and disease might exist. So is the observed exposure among cases higher than expected? So are cases more often exposed than a comparable control group? This comparison group is needed. So baseline exposure, but this gives us the baseline exposure in the population. Some people still are exposed, but are those ones who got ill more exposed than those ones who stayed healthy? This is the idea. So intuitively, if the frequency of exposure is higher among the cases than non-cases, then the incidence rate will probably be higher among exposed than non-exposed. Do you get the point? If most of the people with lung cancer have been smokers, and people without lung cancer have been much less, to a much lower frequency smokers, then maybe smoking might be the cause. Hello? Oh, okay. So the picture for the case control study would look like this. We've got people who are diseased, who are ill, and people who have no disease, who are the controls. They preferably come from the same population. So they're supposed to be very, very similar, except maybe what exposure they were exposed to. So we asked the cases, did you smoke? And we asked the controls, did you smoke? In a retrospective nature. So we asked, what did you do in the past? And this is the way a case control study works. How do we order our data? Actually, again, we develop a 2x2 table, as I showed you before. So we have cases and controls and exposed and non-exposed. So again, we've got A, B, C, and D. And we can calculate the percentage of exposed as A over A plus C, and the exposure in the in the controls as B over B plus D. This overall, how many of them have been exposed, and how many of them have been exposed, of all cases have been exposed. Okay, let me show you an example. Some years ago, I was involved in a big outbreak investigation where in a small town, there were lots of kids with meningitis. So lots of meningitis cases were there. And we wanted to find out what is the cause of this meningitis outbreak. So we had asked a lot of cases, 61 cases, and we tried to find comparable controls. And we asked them, were you in contact to an ill person? Is this one of the major risk factors? And the cases, 69% of them reported us that they had been in close contact with another ill person, while only 18% of the controls. Could this risk factor be a risk factor for this outbreak? What do you think? 69% exposure over 18% exposure? Ida?
Yes.
Yes, it could be. Yeah, because there are certain infectious diseases that causes meningitis.
Exactly. Okay, there was another risk factor which was highly discussed, was the swimming pool, because the swimming pool had recently opened and there was some flooding because of heavy rainfall. And so this was one of the other risk factors under investigation. Now, if we do the same again, look at the exposed among the cases, we see 54% were exposed, and among the controls, how many went to the swimming pool? 59%. Do you think the swimming pool is likely to be the cause of this outbreak?
No.
I think it is still a risk factor. The percentages is not that different.
Yes, exactly. So if you were ill or not ill, the exposure was almost the same. Right. Okay. So this is a very simple approach using a case control study design. Okay. And any questions about the study design? So this is really fast because you've got the ill people already there and you just need to find the perfect controls, the good controls for them.
I just have a question about this slide. If we are looking at the controls, we have the disease more in the controls than in the exposed, right?
Those are all, they have no disease, they have only exposure. Because the cases are the ones with the disease. They all, these 61 have the disease. And these 112 have no disease. But
Okay.
some of them have been in the swimming pool. Out of 112 and 59%. And only 33% of 33 out of the 61 cases had been to the swimming pool. Right? Because there's a big wall in between. Cases are the ill ones and controls are the healthy ones. So they don't have meningitis. And but we have, what you see is we have more controls than cases in our study. That's why also the number looks much higher here. Twice as many people were in the swimming pool. But if you compare the percentages, it's all very similar.
So if we go back to the relative risk, the way we're calculating the relative risk, I think this would bring the relative risk to close to 1 or even less.
The point is, we cannot calculate relative risk in case control study. This is one of the very important factors which we will come up in a few minutes, because there's a big wall. These are two different groups. They are supposed to be similar, but all of them are ill and all of them are healthy. And we can only see, compare what the percentage of exposure is there. So we have to look at it downwards, not horizontal. Okay, but we'll get there. You're really good, Jennifer. You're always very fast in this point. Okay. What I wanted to tell you first is that the cohort study, as you see, is always prospective, because you always have healthy people which you follow over time, some exposed, some are non-exposed, and you will see how many get ill. But, so it's always prospective. Always healthy, start with healthy and some get ill. That's the idea of a cohort study. A case control study is different because you've got cases and controls. You look back in time there. But there's also one version of a cohort study which you can use, which can be really fast. Imagine you are called on a Monday morning in your office. On Saturday or Saturday or Sunday, doesn't matter. Over the weekend, there was a wedding party. And now here you're in the present. You're here on Monday morning. You get the information, and the father of the bride calls you and says, "This is a scandal. There was a big outbreak. We went to this expensive restaurant, and half of our guests all got ill. You have to investigate this. What was the cause of this outbreak?" Okay, can you imagine the situation? So the outbreak happened. It's already over. But you can ask now the father of the bride, who was there at the wedding? He probably will know, because he has a list of all the guests invited. So he can tell you there was this cohort over the weekend. These are the people in the cohort. And you can ask them now, at present, who ate the tuna salad? Who ate the tiramisu? Who ate the ice cream, or whatever could have been risk factors? And you can also find out who didn't eat that. And even you starting here, when the outbreak already happened, the cohort historically existed, and you can identify it, and you can ask the people. So this way you would have a cohort. You can still do a cohort study, because you can investigate all of them, even though the event happened in the past. So you don't have to wait for people to get ill. They are already ill. It's still a prospective approach, because it's a historical cohort. And with this approach, you can be as fast as with a case control study, because you've got people ill, not people who are not ill, and you ask them, what did you eat? Okay, so therefore, a cohort study is still always prospective. Healthy people become exposed, and some of them get ill, either with a historical cohort or with a concurrent cohort. Okay, so hey, it's not necessarily the case that a cohort study can be slow. It can be slow. It can take years. It can take up to, as I mentioned, 50 years, as in the British doctor study, but it can also be done in one day. Okay. In a cohort study, we have the advantage, and Jennifer reminded us on this, that we can analyze the data in prospectively, because we have the exposed and non-exposed, and some develop the disease and some do not develop the disease. So we can calculate the attack rate or absolute risk attack rate. How many of the exposed got ill? The absolute risk or attack rate, A over A plus B. You can see you analyze it in a horizontal fashion, just as because every cohort study is prospective. You start from here in this way. It's just to remember. Maybe if you draw an arrow in your 2x2 table, you will see like, oh, this is a cohort study. Yes, it's easy to calculate it like this. You can also calculate, of course, the risk in the unexposed. And, hello, and if you put this into relationship, risk in the exposed over the risk in the unexposed is a ratio of risks, so risk ratio, or with other words, relative risks. That's why often the RR is used. Okay, I personally like RR very much because these are my initials, but independent from this, this is a very good indicator. Like you can always call it risk ratio, relative risk, or hazard ratio, or whatever. It's always calculated in the same way. You understand that? Easy. You did it on day one of your EPI course. Relative risk is very easy. You just have to understand risk in the exposed over the risk in the unexposed. I go back to the slide, maybe for your memory, this arrow, because always have a look what kind of study design is it. Is it if it's a cohort study, yes, you can calculate it in this way with this arrow. Okay? Any questions about the method? Well, you are experts in this now. Okay, our TB example with the 8 and 1 in the different numbers of cases, it's easy. 8 cases among 215 individuals, and in the non-exposed, in the HIV negative one case in 298. It's so simple, very simple. And if you have a pocket calculator, you can easily identify that the relative risk here of developing a TB for HIV positive ones was more than 10 times higher. Is HIV infection a risk factor now with a relative risk of 10.9? Obvious.
Yes.
Thank you. Absolutely. Okay. So one of the things you need to keep in mind now is cohort study offers you lots of options. You can calculate the attack rate, which is the absolute risk. Very easy. How many? You can calculate the risk difference, one thing which we used before. How much of the risk is due to the exposure? You can calculate as a string, the measure of association, the relative risk. Cool, good, very good. So, but in a case control study, this is difficult, isn't it? Because we've got these two groups, which they are already ill and the others are not ill. And so we cannot calculate rates. We have to measure it in our 2x2 table from top to bottom. The proportion of what we can measure is the proportion of exposure. How many cases were smokers and how many controls were smokers, for example. Is there any way to estimate risks and relative risks? Not really, but being realistic, we can now turn to odds, the odds of exposure. Those ones of you who come from countries with maybe a stronger link to the United Kingdom are probably very familiar to the term odds because it's very closely related to betting. Odds is the probability that an event will happen over the probability that an event will not happen. For example, you use it to calculate when you're betting on football teams. Like I did it when I learned more about this when I was in the Netherlands, and I looked at a football team. I don't know if you're football fans, but Ajax Amsterdam is quite famous, and I had to look at what odds did they have of winning instead of losing or having a draw. And they were really very successful at that time. So the odds of winning is 2.17 over the odds of not winning is and the odds of not winning is 0.46. Okay, I don't want to go into football betting, horse racing betting, or whatever. But what I would like to show you is that we can use this principle to calculate the odds of exposure among cases and the odds of exposure among controls. The odds of exposure among cases is the probability to be exposed among cases over the probability to be unexposed among cases. And vice versa, the other way around, among the controls, it would be very similar, referring to different parts of our 2x2 table. Okay, this sounds all very complicated, and forget about the complication. Looking at our 2x2 table, if you know it's a case control study, you cannot calculate the relative risk. So I would draw an arrow which would be vertical. And I see, okay, I cannot calculate in this way because my arrow goes this way. And I can develop, use different formulas whatsoever, or I can just remember it's the cross product. It's AD over BC is the odds ratio, how to calculate it. So AD divided by BC, the cross product for the case control study. And that's very easy to calculate. Let's have a look at an example. Here is our meningitis case again, with contact to an ill person. If we calculate now the odds ratio, we do 42 times 89 divided over 20 times 19. And magically, you will get the odds ratio of 9.6. 9.8, sorry, my cursor was in the way, 9.8. Okay, so very simple way, AD over BC, AD over BC. That's a way how to calculate an odds ratio. And what does an odds ratio of 9.8 mean? Contact to a case of meningitis among the, what does it mean? Does anybody, how do you interpret the odds ratio of 9.8 for cases being exposed to somebody with an illness? Jennifer.
I just want to try. I'm looking at it that there is the probability for you to be infected or to have the outcome when you're exposed is 9.8 times than when you're not exposed.
That's a very good try if you're looking at a cohort study. But you
okay.
control study, how did it work? Cases are ill, controls are not ill. Cases exposed, controls exposed. Can you try?
So there's a high chance that you will get the disease if you're exposed. A 9.8% chance. Is it?
You're very close, but it's not 100% correct. Thinking about the study design, cases are already ill, so they don't get ill anymore. The controls are healthy and hopefully they don't get ill anymore. But the probability of having been exposed is almost 10 times as high. Shahrukh, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, it means that the exposure or the contacting an ill person is absolutely a risk factor. So that means that there is an increased odd ratios.
Right. Yes, this is what was my original question, actually. Yes, it is a strong risk factor. And but I really like what Jennifer was trying, and this is very good because it's a case control study. So what does an odds ratio of 10, roughly speaking, 10 mean? So cases, it's a case control study, cases were 10 times more likely to be exposed than controls. That's what you wanted to say, Jennifer. This is the right thing, because when we're talking about odds ratio, we're normally talking about a case control study. So cases were more likely, 10 times more likely to be exposed. With other, we assume that the exposure is a risk factor, so then it is what you said, Jennifer, but the right wording, and I think I would very much appreciate if you would understand that and maybe use the right wording for odds ratio, because when you're in an interview for a job, and if you say it in a real proper way, they will know this lady or this gentleman really knows what they're talking about. It's a case controls. Oh yes, what am I talking about? This was a case control study. Okay, so the cases were almost 10 times as more likely to have been exposed to the risk factor. And then everybody knows this is exactly correct. You get my point, Jennifer? Good, good. That's okay. So, okay, so yes, it's a risk factor. Absolutely right, Shuruk. And what about the swimming pool? Was it a risk factor? Is it a risk factor? Now you've got the odds ratio given here. Anshu, what do you think? Anshu, no. Okay, maybe next time.
Let's decide on some. What is your pagination on the thing like that?
It's a risk. It's not a risk factor. Exactly, it's not a risk factor. Cases where less likely, a little bit less likely exposed to the swimming pool, were less likely to have been to the swimming pool than controls. But it's near one, so one would say like, yeah, it's neither nor. It's neither a risk factor nor a protective factor. Good. So, but one thing I still need to tell you, how does relative risk and odds ratio compare? Relative risk and odds ratio in a cohort study, of course, you can also calculate odds ratios in a cohort study. I don't know why you would want to do that, but you could do this. And an odds ratio in a cohort study is similar to an odds ratio in a relative risk in a cohort study if the disease is rare. If the disease is very common, the odds ratio overestimates the association a bit. So the more common it is, the more it overestimates it. So if the disease is rare, it's almost the same. An odds ratio in a cohort and an odds ratio in a case control study are very similar in their strengths if the disease is rare. And an odds ratio in case control is a good estimate for the relative risk if the disease is rare. All right? So far, so clear? So actually, that's why I call it, it's a sister of the relative risk. So it's a very good one. Unfortunately, in a case control study, we cannot calculate relative risks. So we would calculate odds ratios, right? Okay, good. Oh, and now I have to move. The funny thing is I always have to move your pictures somewhere so that I can see some part of the slides. Okay, okay. And now Jennifer asked for the advantages and disadvantages. And Jennifer, I'm delivering. So the advantages of a cohort study are, what are the advantages? And they give estimates of absolute risk and rates. So cohort study is really useful because you can calculate absolute risk, or rates. You can calculate relative risk or rate ratios. You do not have to rely on memory normally because people are healthy. Some smoke. You can ask them, do you smoke? Some don't smoke. So you can follow it over time. So you usually don't have to rely on memory. Can be used for rare exposures, even because you can, if an exposure is very rare, you can still look at a cohort which involves people with this exposure. My brother does, in his spare time, does something like, I don't know, parachute flying or something like this, you call it, from a mountain flying down. Not many people do this, I think. But if you want to find out whether this is how harmful this or how good or whatever it is, you could develop a cohort study in an area where where you would go to the Alps and do a cohort study on this, because where lots of people do this. Okay. You can be used to for exposures, I said, and it's possible to study many different outcomes. Yes, you can study, for example, if you have a cohort study on smoking, like the one which you're going to look at today, you can measure whether the people develop what are potential risk, potential outcomes of smoking. We are 70 years down the line from Richard Dawes. So what do you already know? You're experts,
There are like
OPD.
myocardial diseases.
for example.
Bladder cancer
Okay. Yes.
in young, mostly in young, smoking now increasing bladder cancer and because of smoking.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, just to say, in short, many things. So you can have a look at lots of different outcomes, because if you've got one exposure, you can measure lots of different diseases which might be the result. Very good advantage of the cohort study design. Oh yeah, it's represented here in this slide, but I think this is quite clear. Jennifer, you've got a point.
I was looking at that also as on the other side, where it's like a limitation to the cohort study. If you're looking at, you're looking at smoking and you're thinking the outcome from smoking is supposed to be lung cancer. So you concentrate only on lung cancer and you don't think that actually exposure to this can lead to so many other outcomes. I don't know. It looked like a limitation on my side.
No, the advantage of a cohort study is it depends on how you design your study, but you could also measure not only lung cancer, you can also measure deaths,
Other diseases.
vascular disease, deaths from other cancers, sorts of cancer or whatever. So you could, in a cohort study, you can easily have a look at lots of outcomes. That's the advantage. The disadvantage of a case control study, on the other hand, would be you cannot a problem with where is it? With a case control study is by principle you can only measure one outcome because you're looking at the cases with one disease. You see. Therefore, there's an advantage in a cohort study that you could also look at lots of outcomes. But the disadvantage then in a cohort study would be, Jennifer, what do you think? Can you measure lots of exposures?
I'm looking at it. Maybe you're thinking, you're looking at an outcome and you're imagining that, okay, there are so many other risk factors that could lead to the same outcome. That would be a limitation, maybe.
Multiple exposures, I think, are very difficult in a cohort study. Normally you look at one, maybe two exposures, but that's really difficult. But you can look at lots of outcomes. You see?
Yeah, lots of outcomes, but not multiple exposures. Good, thank you.
Yeah. And there, Jennifer, as you are interested in disadvantages of cohort studies, there are several. I mentioned here some, like large sample size, because you need a lot of people in your cohort so that enough people get ill, so that you can find any association. So often the sample size needs to be relatively large. You often in a concurrent cohort study, you have to think about the latency period. Loss to follow up. So over time, if you do a study over 50 years, like Richard Dawes, you will lose lots of people who just moved to another country and you will not get information anymore. The exposure can change over time. People can stop smoking. Non-smokers can start smoking if they're stupid enough. And so on. Multiple exposure is difficult, I mentioned. Ethical considerations might be really, really a big problem in a cohort study, because if you know after 5 years smoking causes lung cancer, are you still not gonna do anything against it? You probably would have to tell all the smokers, hey, stop. We already know that what you're doing is not really good for you, might kill you. And And due to the long follow-up, large sample size and so on, you might have high costs in a cohort study. Do you agree, Jennifer? Are you happy with this? Are at least some of the key disadvantages. Okay. In contrast to this, the case control studies can have certain advantages, of course. They're good for rare diseases. Why? I explained why a cohort study is good for rare exposures. So why can a case control study be good for rare diseases?
Because you already have the disease.
Because you start from the point of the disease. So Mian, you wanted to say?
No, that was what I was just came to my mind, because in contrast to cohort, you start with the disease, whereas in cohort you start with an exposure. So you're still waiting to the disease to develop, and you never know if it develops. So whereas in case control, you already have the disease.
Exactly. For example, in the time of the mad cow diseases, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was under much more interest for lots of people, but this is very, very rare. So if you would do a cohort study for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, it's maybe 1 in a million or 1 in several 100,000 individuals over lifetime they develop the disease. You would have to have a study in a country with a small population. Okay, in India you could probably do a study like this. Very expensive, but you could do it because you've got so many people. But what about Denmark? It's impossible to do a cohort study on such a rare disease ever in Denmark. Therefore, a case control study would have strong advantages. You would just look at all the cases and interview them. The several exposures can be measured. Of course, you can ask them about lots of the ill people about lots of exposures. Did you smoke? Did you drink? Did you whatever? It can be very fast. It can be relatively low cost because you don't have to wait and you don't have to ask too many people. With relatively small sample size, you can get good results. Half of the data might be even available already because the cases are there and they might have been already been interviewed. And there are not really ethical problems because the ill people are ill and the controls are hopefully not ill, are not supposed to be ill, and you don't follow over time and so on. They just live their normal lives. So there are some good advantages for case control study. Here again, the multiple exposure slide. But there are also some disadvantages. And Jennifer, also for case control studies, there are disadvantages. So they do not estimate risk and rates. Why is it clear for you why we cannot calculate a relative risk with a case control study? Is it clear, or are there any questions? Because cases are there and we can only ask about exposure among the cases, and the controls is the same. So we cannot estimate risk and rates. The selection of controls might be really difficult, and we discuss it certainly next week again in our outbreak investigation. What is a good comparable control group? Who chooses a control group in a case control study? Is it given by the nature of the problem, or is it given by you? Is it chosen by you? You are the epidemiologist. Yes, you're right. It's chosen by you yourself. So you have to choose the right one. You might have problems with confounding. We'll talk about this more on day 4. Not suitable for rare exposures. Okay, because rare exposures, again, yes, we might not find them in our case and control group. Problems with mass significance and data dredging might be there. If you are just using lots of data, if you do 100 tests, Several of them will be positive even though there's no association. Have to rely on memory and registers because it's a retrospective study design. Okay. So, finished with this lecture. What do you think? What is best? Cohort studies allow measures, here some advantages and disadvantages. So which study design do you think is best? I want at least
I
to,
think I'm biased towards the case control studies.
Yep.
And it is also based on some experience, previous experience, whereby in the lab where I was, there was a study going on, a cohort study going on HIV discordant couples. So they were trying to study why is it that in some couples, one person is HIV positive and the other one is not.